The cafe smelled of freshly ground coffee and warm pastries, the kind of scent that wrapped around you like a familiar embrace. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long golden streaks across the polished wooden floors. It was the kind of place where people came to linger, friends catching up, couples lost in each other's eyes, and lonely souls pretending to be busy with their laptops. She sat alone in the corner, a small leather-bound journal open before her. A silver pen twirled between her fingers as she studied the people around her, her gaze sharp but unreadable. Then, she saw them. A couple, oblivious to the world. The man leaned forward, his entire focus on the woman before him. His expression softened whenever she spoke, as if every word she said was the most important thing he'd ever heard. The woman, in turn, beamed, her laughter light and free. Their hands rested inches apart on the table, fingers brushing now and then, as if pulled together by some invisible force. The woman in the corner watched, her pen gliding swiftly across the page. Rule number 1, make people feel seen. She barely noticed the man who had been watching her in return. He had been sitting 2 tables away, sipping a black coffee that had long since gone cold. He followed her gaze to the couple and then back to her, his curiosity growing by the second. She wasn't just observing them, she was analyzing them, as if she knew something the rest of the world didn't. The moment she closed her journal, he couldn't hold his curiosity any longer. "Excuse me," he said, leaning slightly toward her table. "Were you just taking notes on those 2? She glanced up, startled for only a second before her expression settled into quiet amusement. "I was." The man hesitated. "Why?" She gestured toward the couple, who were now lost in quiet whispers, as if the rest of the cafe had vanished. "Because I know exactly why they are in love." He scoffed. "That's impossible." She smiled. "Is it?" The challenge in her voice made him pause. She wasn't joking. She wasn't guessing. She knew something. "I can prove it," she continued. "Not just with them. With anyone. Love isn't some random accident. There are rules, powerful ones. And if you know how to follow them, you can make anyone fall deeply in love with you." The man leaned back, crossing his arms. "You're telling me you can control love?" She shook her head. "No. But I can teach you how to create the conditions where love becomes inevitable." The words lingered between them, strange yet undeniable. 7 rules, she said, tapping her journal. "If you understand them, you'll never have to chase love again. It will find you." The man stared at her, torn between disbelief and the quiet, gnawing thought, what if she's right? A moment later, he made his decision. "All right," he said. "Teach me." The woman's smile deepened, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Then let's begin." The man sat back in his chair, crossing his arms as he studied the woman before him. There was something unsettling about how calm and certain she was, as if she had unlocked some hidden truth about love that the rest of the world hadn't figured out yet. He glanced at her journal. "So, these rules of yours, how do they work?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the couple, who were now leaning even closer, their fingers finally intertwined on the table. "Look at them," she said softly. "Tell me, why do you think they're so drawn to each other?" The man frowned, observing them for a moment. "Chemistry," he guessed. "They just click." She shook her head. "That's what most people think. But chemistry isn't some magical, uncontrollable force. It's created." He raised an eyebrow. "By what?" A slow smile spread across her lips. "By this." She picked up her pen and pointed toward the man at the other table. "Do you see how he's looking at her?" The man followed her gaze. The male half of the couple was staring at his partner with an intensity that was almost unnerving, like she was the only person in the entire universe. He's focused, she continued. Not just hearing her, but actually seeing her. Every little thing she does, every flicker of emotion on her face, he's noticing it. And she feels it. That's why she's leaning in. That's why she's smiling like that. That's why she feels safe, comfortable, important. She turned back to him. Rule number 1, make people feel seen. The man scoffed. That's it? Just pay attention? She laughed lightly. Not just attention. Genuine attention. Most people spend their whole lives feeling unnoticed, unimportant. When someone comes along who truly sees them, not just their words, but their emotions, their fears, their dreams, that's irresistible. It's how real connection begins. The man thought about it for a moment. He had been on dates before. Some good, some forgettable. But now that she mentioned it, he realized something. On the best ones, it had never been about how good he looked or what he said. It was about how it felt. And the people who had made him feel that way? They had truly seen him. But how do you do that? He asked, still skeptical. She leaned forward slightly. Try this, the next time you talk to someone, really listen. Don't think about what you're going to say next. Don't let your mind wander. Just focus on them. Watch their eyes. Their hands. Notice when they hesitate, when they get excited, when their voice changes. And most importantly, make them feel like what they're saying is the most important thing in the world. She paused. Then watch how they respond. The man frowned. You're saying people will just fall in love if I do that? She shrugged. Love is built on connection. And connection starts with making someone feel truly seen. Try it and see for yourself. The challenge in her voice made something inside him stir. He could argue all day, but there was only one way to know if she was right. He glanced around the cafe and spotted a barista wiping down a nearby table. Normally, he would just nod politely, maybe mumble a thanks if they crossed paths. But this time, he tried something different. As she passed, he looked up and smiled. Long shift? The barista paused, surprised. Yeah, she admitted with a small laugh. Felt like it would never end. Instead of just nodding and turning away, he focused. That bad? She sighed, rubbing her forehead. Non-stop customers. And a guy spilled an entire iced coffee on me earlier. The man grinned. Oof. That's rough. Did you at least get a break? She blinked, then smiled, a real, genuine smile. Not really, but it's okay. Almost done now. Still, he said, shaking his head. They should give you a medal. She laughed. Not polite. Not forced. Real. I'll take a raise instead. With that, she walked away, but as she did, she glanced back at him, just for a second, as if seeing him in a new light. The man turned back to the woman at the table, stunned. That was different. She simply smiled. You saw her. And for just a moment, she felt it. The man swallowed. Maybe she was onto something after all. The man sat back, still replaying the brief conversation with the barista in his mind. He hadn't said anything particularly clever. He hadn't flirted. He hadn't tried to impress her. All he had done was pay attention. And yet, the shift in her expression had been unmistakable, like she had suddenly felt seen in a way that most people ignored. He turned back to the woman across from him, who was sipping her coffee with a knowing smile. All right, he admitted. That was interesting. She set her cup down. You did well. You noticed her frustration, acknowledged it, and made her feel like she wasn't just another worker blending into the background. The man exhaled. So, what now? Do I just go around making eye contact with people and asking about their day? She chuckled. Not quite. That was only the first step. Now, you need to make yourself unforgettable. He frowned. Unforgettable? She leaned forward slightly. Rule number 2, create unforgettable moments. The man raised an eyebrow. You mean, like grand romantic gestures? Flowers? Candlelit dinners? She shook her head. No. People don't fall in love because of big gestures, they fall in love because of how someone makes them feel. And the most powerful way to do that? Create small, meaningful moments that stay with them long after you've gone. He scoffed. That sounds vague. She smirked. All right. Let me give you a real example. The man crossed his arms, listening as she began her story. A story of an unforgettable moment. There was a woman I knew once, she started. She had been on dozens of dates, fancy dinners, expensive gifts, grand speeches about love. But none of them stuck. None of them left a real impact. And then one day, she met a man who did something different. They were walking through a park when she mentioned, completely offhand, that she loved the sound of wind chimes. She didn't think anything of it, it was just casual conversation. But a week later, when they met again, he handed her a small package. Inside was a simple, handcrafted wind chime. You mentioned you liked them, he said. So I made you one. That was it. No expensive jewelry. No over-the-top declaration of love. Just a small, thoughtful act that told her, I was listening. You matter. I remember. And that was the moment she started falling in love. Back to the cafe, the man stared at her, processing the story. That worked? He asked. She smiled. It's not about the thing. It's about the feeling. People don't fall in love with grand gestures, they fall in love with the moments that make them feel uniquely understood. Moments that say, I see you. I remember you. The man tapped his fingers on the table. So you're saying that if I want to make someone feel something real, I need to create memorable moments? She nodded. Exactly. Not necessarily big ones, just meaningful ones. He thought for a second, then looked back at the barista, who was now busy behind the counter. If I wanted to test this, he said, how would I start? The woman leaned back. Think. What small thing did she share with you? What detail did she reveal? He frowned, replaying the conversation in his head. Then, it hit him. She joked about wanting a raise, he murmured. The woman smiled. Good. Now, what can you do with that? The man hesitated, then stood up. He walked over to the counter, where the barista was filling a cup. When she turned to him, he slid a napkin across the counter with a scribbled note, You deserve a raise. Underneath it, he'd drawn a tiny, cartoon-like golden medal. The barista looked at the napkin, then at him. For a second, she just stared. Then, a laugh burst out of her, bright and genuine. She picked up the napkin like it was the most valuable thing she had ever received. Best tip I've gotten all day, she grinned, shaking her head. The man smiled, then turned and walked back to his seat. The woman across from him simply sipped her coffee, eyes twinkling. Well? She asked. He exhaled. That had felt different. It wasn't flirting. It wasn't manipulation. It was just a moment. And the way she had looked at him, like she would remember that moment long after today, told him everything he needed to know. Maybe this woman was onto something after all. The cafe felt different now. Or maybe, he felt different. The man sat at the small wooden table, the woman's knowing gaze fixed on him. He was still reeling from what had just happened. A simple napkin, a scribbled joke, and yet, the look on the barista's face had been unexpected. There had been a spark in her eyes, a flicker of something real. Was it admiration? Intrigue? He wasn't sure. But one thing was certain, she would remember him. And that was exactly what the woman across from him had been talking about. She tapped the edge of her coffee cup. "Tell me what you're thinking." The man exhaled. "I don't know. I mean, I didn't do anything special. I didn't buy her a drink or ask for her number or try to impress her." The woman smiled knowingly. He frowned. "Exactly. I wasn't trying to do anything. I just noticed something, and I made a small joke about it." "And yet," the woman said, tilting her head, "she looked at you like you were different from every other customer she's served today." He swallowed. That was the part that bothered him the most. Not in a bad way, just in a way that challenged everything he thought he knew about attraction. Because if something so small could make an impact, what did that say about everything he had believed about love before? She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "Now, let me ask you something." He nodded, waiting. "Do you think she felt something?" The question caught him off guard. Did she? He thought back to the moment, the way her eyes had widened, the way her laughter had lingered, the way she had held onto the napkin like it was something precious. It was a feeling. The woman across from him smiled. "That, my friend, is where real connection starts." She lifted her journal and flipped to a blank page. With a graceful hand, she wrote 3 words in neat cursive, "Rule number 3, be the safe place." He frowned. "What does that mean?" She placed her pen down. "Love isn't just about attraction or interest. It's about something deeper, something safe. People fall in love when they feel like they can be themselves with someone. When they feel understood. When they feel," she paused, then tapped the page. "Emotionally safe." The man stared at the words. "So, what, you're saying I need to be a therapist now?" She laughed. "No. But you do need to be someone who makes others feel heard and valued. Someone who doesn't judge, who listens, who makes people feel like their feelings actually matter." She tilted her head. "Do you know what the most common phrase is after someone falls in love?" He shook his head. She smiled. "I feel like I can be myself around them." The words hit him harder than he expected. Because it was true. He thought back to the relationships he had seen, his friends, his family, even his own past relationships. The best ones weren't built on grand gestures or physical attraction alone. They were built on comfort. On safety. On the feeling that, around that person, you could breathe. He exhaled. "So, how do I do that?" She leaned back. "That's the test. The challenge." The woman tapped her journal. "I want you to try something." The man narrowed his eyes. "What?" She glanced around the cafe, then nodded toward a young woman sitting alone by the window. She was staring out at the street, stirring her untouched coffee absent-mindedly. "She looks upset," the woman observed. "I want you to go talk to her." The man's eyes widened. "Talk to her? About what?" She smirked. "That's up to you. But remember, you're not trying to impress her. You're not trying to be funny or clever. Your only goal is to make her feel," she tapped the journal again. "Safe." He hesitated. "And if I fail?" The woman shrugged. "Then you'll learn something. And learning is never a failure." The man exhaled. Then, before he could overthink it, he stood up. The woman at the window didn't notice him approach at first. She had a distant look in her eyes, her fingers lightly tapping against the side of her cup. He cleared his throat gently. "Hey. Mind if I sit?" She blinked, snapping out of her thoughts. "Oh. Sure." He slid into the seat across from her, taking a second to observe her expression. There was a heaviness there, something unspoken but felt. He could have gone for small talk. He could have asked her about the weather or what she was drinking. But instead, he decided to try something different. "You seem like you've got a lot on your mind," he said softly. Her lips parted slightly, as if surprised by the directness. She hesitated, then exhaled a small laugh. "That obvious?" He nodded. "Yeah. But in a way that says you probably don't talk about it much." She stared at him, something flickering behind her eyes. Then, she spoke. She told him about a rough week at work. About a fight with a friend. About how she felt exhausted but had no one to really talk to about it. And as she spoke, he did something he never used to do before. He listened. Not just to the words, but to the way she said them. To the pauses. The hesitations. The things she wasn't saying. And for the first time in a long time, she felt safe. When she finished, she exhaled, looking almost lighter. "Wow," she murmured. "I didn't realize how much I needed to get that off my chest." The man smiled. "Sometimes you just need someone to listen." She looked at him then, really looked at him. And there it was. That shift, that moment where someone realizes they're seen. And in that moment, he understood. The aftermath. He returned to his table after a while, his mind racing. The woman across from him was watching, smiling slightly. "Well?" He sat down, shaking his head. "I think I get it now." She raised an eyebrow. "Get what?" He ran a hand through his hair, still processing it all. "This whole thing. It's not about tricks or..." The air inside the cafe felt different now, like the moment before a storm, filled with potential. The man sat across from the woman, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. He had just experienced something he couldn't fully explain, something that felt real in a way that books, movies, and dating advice never quite captured. He had made a connection. Not because he had been charming. Not because he had tried to impress anyone. But because he had simply been there. Present. Listening. Giving someone space to be themselves. And now, he was ready for more. The woman across from him watched him with that same knowing smile, as if she could see the questions forming in his mind before he even spoke them. Finally, he broke the silence. "You said the next rule is give before you take." He leaned forward. "What does that mean?" The woman tapped her pen against her journal, thinking for a moment before she answered. "It means that love isn't about getting. It's about giving." The man frowned slightly. "That sounds obvious." She smirked. "Is it? Because most people don't actually live by it. They approach love with a different mindset. They ask themselves, what can I get from this person? How will they make me happy? What do they bring to my life?" She paused. But the people who truly make others fall in love with them? They think differently. They don't focus on what they're getting. They focus on what they're giving. The man sat back, absorbing her words. He had heard people say things like this before, phrases about selflessness, about putting others first. But hearing it now, after what he had just experienced, it hit differently. "Okay," he said slowly. "So how do I apply it?" The woman leaned back, a small smile playing on her lips. "I'm going to give you a test." The man raised an eyebrow. "Another one?" She nodded. "But this one is different." She glanced around the cafe, then her eyes landed on something, or someone. She subtly gestured with her chin. "See that guy over there?" The man followed her gaze to a table near the window. A middle-aged man sat alone, staring at his coffee, his expression distant. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened. There was something about him that looked tired. Not just physically, but emotionally. The man turned back to the woman. What about him? She smiled. I want you to do something for him. Something small. Something that asks for nothing in return. The man hesitated. Like what? She shrugged. That's up to you. But whatever you do, make sure it comes from the right place. The man glanced back at the stranger. He wasn't sure why, but something inside him told him to go. So, he did. The power of giving. He walked up to the table cautiously, clearing his throat as he approached. The older man looked up, his expression mildly surprised. Hey, the man said. I don't mean to interrupt, but, you okay? The stranger blinked, as if no one had asked him that in a long time. He chuckled softly. I've had better days. The man nodded. Yeah, I get that. He hesitated, then said, Listen, I don't know what's going on, and I won't pretend to. But I just wanted to say, whatever it is, I hope it gets better. The older man studied him for a moment, then exhaled a small laugh. That's oddly nice of you. The man shrugged. Sometimes, people just need to hear it. There was a pause. Then, something in the older man's face shifted. He straightened up slightly, as if the weight on his shoulders had lifted just a little. You know, I was actually about to leave, he admitted. Long day. But maybe I'll stick around a little longer. The man smiled. Good idea. Coffee's still warm. With that, he nodded and walked away, back toward his table. He didn't know if he had changed anything. But that wasn't the point. He had given something, without expectation. Without asking for anything in return. And somehow, it felt better than anything he had ever done to try to impress someone before. The lesson. The woman was watching when he sat back down, her eyes filled with something approving. Well? She asked. The man let out a small laugh. That was weirdly satisfying. She smirked. Because it was real. He nodded slowly. It was. And you're right, most people don't think like that. They think about what they can take. Not what they can give. She lifted her pen and flipped to a new page. Rule number 5, vulnerability creates connection. The man arched an eyebrow. Vulnerability? She nodded. If you want someone to fall in love with you, you have to be willing to be seen. And not just the good parts. She looked him in the eye. The real parts. The man hesitated. He wasn't sure why, but this rule felt harder. Scarier. And somehow, he knew that the next lesson was going to be the most difficult one yet. The moment of truth. The woman sat back, letting him absorb what she had just said. Most people think love is about being perfect, she continued. They try to be the most charming, the most attractive, the most interesting. But real love? It happens when people see the flaws, the fears, the insecurities, and they still choose to stay. The man swallowed. That sounds terrifying. She smiled. Because it is. She tapped her pen against the table. That's why so many people struggle with relationships. They're too busy trying to be liked instead of being known. The man exhaled. And how do I change that? She leaned forward, locking eyes with him. You tell the truth, she said simply. You stop hiding. You stop pretending. You let someone see you, the real you. She tilted her head. And you see what happens next. The man hesitated. Because this was something he had always avoided. He was used to being guarded. To keeping his emotions under control. But something inside him told him that if he didn't take this next step, he would never understand what love really meant. And for the first time, he was ready to try. The cafe seemed quieter now. Or maybe, the silence was inside him. The man sat across from the woman, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. He had learned so much, things that felt real, things that worked. And yet, this next lesson, vulnerability, felt like the hardest one. He had spent his whole life trying to be strong, to be put together, to never show weakness. But now, she was telling him that love wasn't about perfection. It was about being seen. Truly seen. And that terrified him. The woman sipped her coffee slowly, watching him. "You're afraid." He exhaled sharply. "Yeah. A little." She smiled. "Good. That means you're starting to understand." The man frowned. "How does being vulnerable make someone fall in love with you?" She set her cup down and leaned forward. "Because people don't fall in love with perfection," she said softly. "They fall in love with realness. With flaws. With the little things that make someone human." She tapped her pen against her journal. "Think about the people you've loved the most," she said. "Not just romantically, friends, family, anyone. Why did you love them?" The man thought about it. It wasn't because they were perfect. It was because they had let him in. Because he had seen their fears, their struggles, their failures, and yet, they were still trying. They were real. And he had loved them for it. The woman smiled as if she could see the realization forming in his mind. "That's why vulnerability creates connection," she said. "When you let someone see you, not just the good parts, but the messy, uncertain, flawed parts, you give them a choice. A choice to stay. To accept you. To love you for exactly who you are." The man exhaled. "That's scary." She nodded. "Yes. But that's also why it's powerful. Because when someone chooses you after seeing the real you, that's the kind of love that lasts." The words hit him hard, because for the first time, he saw love differently. Not as something to earn. Not as something to chase. But as something to share. And to share it, he had to be brave enough to be seen. The challenge of vulnerability. The woman leaned back. "I want you to do something." The man raised an eyebrow. "Another challenge?" She smirked. "Think of someone in your life. Someone you care about. And tell them something real. Something you've been afraid to say." He hesitated. There were so many things he had never said. Things he had buried under confidence, charm, and distance. But now he knew he had to try. The test begins that night. He sat in his apartment, staring at his phone. There was one person he had always kept at a distance. Someone who had been in his life for years, but who had never really known him. His best friend. The guy who had always been there, through breakups, failures, and bad decisions. But he had never told him how much that meant. And now, for the first time, he was about to. He picked up the phone and dialed. His friend answered after a few rings. "Yo, what's up?" The man hesitated, suddenly unsure. Not much. Just wanted to talk." There was a pause. "Everything okay?" He exhaled. "Yeah. Actually, I realized something today." Another pause. "Okay," the man swallowed, his throat dry. "I don't think I ever told you this, but I appreciate you, man. Like, really. You've always been there for me. And I don't think I've ever said how much that means." Silence. And for a moment, he panicked. Had he said too much? Had he made things weird? Then, his friend cleared his throat. "Damn, man. Where's this coming from?" The man laughed nervously. "Just something I learned today. About not holding back what really matters." His friend was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice softer than usual, he said, I appreciate you too, bro. And just like that, something shifted. A wall came down. And their friendship, one that had always been easy, but never deep, felt realer than it ever had before. The lesson the next day, he walked into the cafe and sat across from the woman, a strange mix of pride and uncertainty in his chest. She raised an eyebrow. Well? He smirked. I think I get it now. She leaned forward. Tell me. He took a breath. Vulnerability isn't just about relationships. It's about all connections. It's about letting people see you, even when it's scary. She smiled. And? He exhaled. And, it makes things real. She nodded approvingly. That's right. Then, she flipped to a new page in her journal and wrote, Rule number 6, respect earns love. The man arched an eyebrow. Now that one seems obvious. She chuckled. You'd think so. But most people don't really understand it. She leaned in. Do you want to know the one thing that makes love last? The man nodded. She tapped her pen against the words. Respect. He frowned slightly. You mean, like, being nice to someone? She laughed. No. I mean real respect. Seeing someone not as a prize, not as an object, not as a means to your own happiness, but as an equal. She tilted her head. Most people think passion is what keeps love alive. But it's not. Passion fades. Looks fade. Excitement fades. But when you respect someone, when you admire who they are, what they stand for, how they think, that's the kind of love that never dies. The man let that sink in. He had never thought about love that way before. Not as excitement. Not as desire. But as admiration. And suddenly, everything made sense. The hardest truth. The woman studied him for a moment. Then, she said something that caught him completely off guard. Tell me, have you ever truly respected the people you've been with? The man froze. Because the answer hit him before he could stop it. And it wasn't what he wanted to admit. He had dated. He had been in relationships. But had he ever really respected them? Had he ever truly seen them as equals? Or had he always been thinking about himself? His chest tightened. And for the first time, he realized. Maybe he had been doing it wrong all along. The cafe was nearly empty now, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The man sat across from the woman, her journal still open between them. Her last question lingered in his mind, pressing against something deep, something he had spent years avoiding. Tell me, have you ever truly respected the people you've been with? He hadn't answered. Because the truth was. No. Not fully. Not in the way she meant. And now, sitting here, staring at those words in her journal, respect earns love, he realized something that shook him. Maybe, all this time, he had been chasing the wrong thing. The realization. The man ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. I think I get it now. The woman raised an eyebrow. Oh. He nodded. I used to think love was about attraction. Passion. Excitement. She smiled slightly. And now? He exhaled. Now, I think it's about admiration. About actually liking the person, not just for how they make you feel, but for who they are. The woman leaned back in her chair. That's right. She tapped her pen against the table. Most people don't realize it, but real, lasting love doesn't come from need. It comes from choice. The man frowned. Choice? She nodded. Think about it. Have you ever met someone who seemed perfect for you, but for some reason, you just didn't feel it? He thought about it. He had. Plenty of times, good people. Kind. smart, attractive. But something had been missing. And have you ever met someone, she continued, who maybe wasn't what you expected, but the more you learned about them, the more you started to admire them? The man hesitated. Because now, thinking about it, that was real. That was what stuck. She smiled, as if she could see the realization forming in his mind. That's because love isn't about who fits a checklist. It's about who you respect. Who you truly see. Who you admire, not just desire. The words hit him in a way he wasn't prepared for. Because he suddenly realized. That's why his past relationships had never lasted. He had liked them. He had been attracted to them. But he had never truly admired them. Not in the way that mattered. The hardest question. The woman flipped to a fresh page in her journal and wrote, Rule number 7, love isn't about control, it's about understanding. The man frowned. What does that mean? She set her pen down. Tell me something, why do most relationships fail? He thought about it. Fights? Misunderstandings? Falling out of love? She shook her head. Those are symptoms. Not the cause. The man frowned. Then what's the cause? She leaned forward. The real reason most relationships fail is because people try to control love instead of understanding it. The man blinked. What do you mean? She smiled. People go into relationships thinking, if I just say the right things, do the right things, be the right person, I can make them love me the way I want to be loved. She tilted her head. But love doesn't work that way. She tapped her journal. Love isn't a strategy. It's not about winning someone over. It's not about fixing them. It's not about changing them into who you think they should be. She paused. It's about understanding them. Accepting them. Seeing them as they are, not as you wish they were. The words sent a shockwave through him. Because he realized. That's what he had been doing wrong all along. He had always tried to make love work on his terms. To make people fit into what he thought love should look like. But real love, the kind that lasted, wasn't about changing someone. It was about choosing them, again and again, as they were. The ultimate test. The woman closed her journal and looked at him. I have one last challenge for you. The man smirked. Another one? She nodded. This is the most important one. She tilted her head. I want you to think of someone you've dated. Someone it didn't work out with. His stomach twisted slightly. There was one name that came to mind immediately. She must have seen the look on his face because she smiled. Got someone? He nodded. Yeah. She folded her hands. Now, tell me something. Looking back, did you really understand them? The man opened his mouth to say yes, then stopped. Because the truth was. He hadn't. Not really. He had tried to make the relationship work. He had tried to be what he thought she wanted. But he had never truly understood her. What she needed. What she feared. What she dreamed about. He had been so focused on making her love him that he had never stopped to truly love her. Not in the way she had needed. His throat felt tight. The woman watched him carefully. Realizing something? He exhaled. Yeah. She smiled gently. You see, love isn't about forcing things. It's about choosing someone, fully, completely, for who they are. Not who you want them to be. She tilted her head. And if you can't do that? The man swallowed. Then it's not love. The words hit him like a weight he had been carrying for years. Because suddenly, everything made sense. Why his past relationships had failed. Why he had never truly felt satisfied. Because he had never really chosen someone. He had never really loved them. Not fully. Not the way real love worked. The moment of truth.